The room went completely silent when the billionaire CEO pushed a sealed envelope across the table and laughed. "Read this letter aloud, and I'll pay you $1 million. Everyone expected the quiet office assistant to stumble, panic, or walk away. Nobody expected her to look at the envelope, take one slow breath, and say something that would make the most powerful man in the room lose the color in his face. For years, people had underestimated Elena Brooks because she dressed simply, spoke softly, and never demanded attention. At 31, she worked as an administrative assistant on the 42nd floor of Sterling Holdings, a company where executives arrived in luxury cars and junior employees learned quickly that their opinions mattered only when someone important repeated them. Elena had learned to survive there by keeping her head down, doing her work perfectly, and going home every evening to the small apartment she shared with her 12-year-old daughter, Mia. What nobody at Sterling knew was that Elena carried a secret history behind those tired eyes, a history that had taught her something money could never buy, the value of keeping a promise. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change someone's life, if you believe people deserve second chances, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying the strength nobody can see. The day everything changed began like an ordinary Monday. Elena arrived before sunrise, carrying a worn brown handbag and a paper cup of coffee. She had spent the previous night helping Mia finish a school project, then stayed awake for another hour reviewing medical bills and household expenses. Her bank balance was frighteningly low, and the rent was due in 4 days. Still, she smiled when Mia had hugged her that morning and promised she would be there for the school presentation on Friday. That promise mattered more to Elena than the money in her account. At Sterling Holdings, however, promises were rarely as valuable as profits. The company's CEO, Richard Sterling, was famous for being brilliant, impatient, and ruthless. He was 48, impeccably dressed, and rarely entered a room without making everyone straighten their backs. He had built Sterling Holdings from a small investment company into a global corporation, and over the years, his success had convinced him that almost every problem could be solved with money. That morning, Richard summoned several senior executives into the main conference room. Elena was asked to bring documents and take notes. She entered quietly and noticed something unusual on the table, an old white envelope with faded edges. There was no company logo, no legal stamp, and no return address. Only one handwritten sentence appeared across the front. For the person who still remembers. Elena stopped for half a second. Something about the handwriting unsettled her. She had seen it before. But before she could examine the envelope more closely, Richard entered the room. The meeting began with a discussion about an acquisition, but Richard seemed distracted. After several minutes, he picked up the envelope and looked around the room. He explained that the letter inside had been discovered in a storage box belonging to his late father, Arthur Sterling, the man who had originally founded the company. Nobody knew why Arthur had kept it. Richard said he had tried to read the letter himself, but the handwriting and faded ink made parts of it difficult to understand. He had asked several people to decipher it, yet none could make sense of the final page. Then his eyes landed on Elena. He remembered that she had once mentioned studying literature and old handwritten documents before leaving college to support her family. Richard smiled in a way that made several executives uncomfortable. He held up the envelope and announced that he would pay her $1 million if she could read the entire letter and explain what it meant. At first, everyone laughed. Elena didn't. She stared at the envelope. The amount was absurd. $1 million could erase every financial worry she had, pay Mia's education, buy a safe home, and give them a future Elena had stopped allowing herself to imagine. But something inside her whispered that this wasn't really a joke. She slowly walked toward the table. Richard slid the envelope toward her. Elena touched the paper. Her fingers began to tremble. She recognized the handwriting. Not because she had seen it in a textbook. Not because she had studied it. She recognized it because 20 years earlier, when she was 11 years old, that same handwriting had written a letter to her mother. A letter that had changed Elena's entire childhood. Her mother had worked as a cleaner in the original Sterling Holdings building. She had been accused of stealing money from a senior executive and dismissed without explanation. She had insisted she was innocent, but nobody listened. Except one person. Arthur Sterling. Elena's mother had told her that Arthur was the only wealthy man who had ever looked her in the eyes without making her feel invisible. According to her mother, Arthur had promised to investigate the accusation. But before he could finish, he suffered a serious health crisis and disappeared from the company for several months. Elena's family eventually moved away. The investigation was forgotten. Or so everyone believed. Elena looked at the envelope again. Richard noticed the change in her expression and assumed she was frightened by the challenge. He leaned back in his chair and repeated that the $1 million offer still stood. Elena carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, several pages long. The first page was badly faded. The second was clearer. The third contained a list of names. And the final page contained a sentence that made Elena's heart pound. She recognized her mother's name. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Elena began reading. Her voice was quiet at first, but the room gradually became still. The letter explained that Arthur Sterling had discovered evidence that Elena's mother had not stolen anything. The missing money had been transferred by another employee who had manipulated the accounting system. Arthur had intended to expose the fraud, restore Elena's mother's reputation, and compensate her for the years of hardship. But there was more. Arthur had discovered that several executives were involved. He had planned to report them. The letter contained dates, names, account references, and instructions for recovering evidence that had been hidden inside an old company archive. Richard's smile disappeared. One of the senior executives stood up. Elena continued reading. Then she reached the final paragraph. Arthur had written that if the letter was ever found, it should be given to the daughter of the woman who had been falsely accused. He had written that he did not know whether the daughter would ever return to Sterling Holdings. But if she did, he wanted her to know one thing. Her mother's name had never been forgotten. Elena lowered the letter. Nobody spoke. Richard stared at her, as if he had suddenly seen someone from another lifetime. He asked her mother's name. Elena answered. The room became even quieter. Richard's father had kept records of the case. Records that had disappeared. Richard looked at the senior executives. One of them suddenly asked whether the letter could be authenticated. Elena carefully placed the pages on the table. She explained that the handwriting matched older documents she had seen during her childhood, but the evidence inside the letter needed to be verified. She wasn't interested in revenge. She simply wanted the truth. That sentence affected Richard more than anything else. Because for the first time in his career, someone had been given an opportunity to demand millions from him and had chosen something else. Truth. Richard ordered an immediate investigation. Within days, the company discovered that Arthur's suspicions had been correct. Financial records hidden in an old archive confirmed that Elena's mother had been framed. The employees responsible had long since left the company, but their actions had caused devastating consequences for several families. Elena's mother had spent years believing that nobody had believed her. She had died before learning that Arthur Sterling had tried to clear her name. When Elena told Mia about the discovery, the little girl asked why her mother wasn't angry. Elena smiled sadly. She explained that being angry could be understandable, but carrying anger forever was another kind of prison. The investigation eventually cleared her mother's name officially. Richard also discovered something that embarrassed him deeply. His father had established a private fund decades earlier to compensate employees who had been harmed by corporate misconduct. The fund had been abandoned after Arthur's death. Richard reopened it. He offered Elena the $1 million he had originally promised. But Elena didn't accept it immediately. She asked him to use part of the money to create a scholarship for children of overlooked workers. She asked for another portion to support former employees who had been unfairly dismissed. Only after those requests were agreed to did she accept the remaining amount for Mia's future and her own family. Richard asked her why she had not simply taken the full $1,000,000. Elena told him that money could change a life, but kindness could change generations. Those words stayed with him. Months later, Elena no longer worked as an assistant. She became the director of the new Employee Support Foundation. Her office was still modest. Her clothes were still simple. She still arrived early. But now, whenever a frightened employee entered her office, she listened. Because she remembered what it felt like to be ignored. Mia eventually gave her school presentation. Elena sat in the front row. When her daughter finished, their eyes met across the room. Mia smiled. Elena smiled back. For the first time in many years, Elena felt that the promise she had made to her daughter was becoming bigger than survival. It was becoming a future. And Richard Sterling changed too. He still ran the company. He still demanded excellence. But he stopped assuming that wealth made someone wiser. He began listening to employees whose names he had never known. He learned that leadership wasn't simply about making decisions. Sometimes leadership meant admitting that someone else had been right. Sometimes it meant opening a door for someone who had spent years standing outside it. And sometimes it meant having the courage to read a letter that revealed the mistakes of the people who came before you. The old envelope was eventually placed inside a glass display case in the company's foundation office. Beneath it was a simple plaque. Not honoring a billionaire. Not celebrating a fortune. But honoring the courage to tell the truth when the truth was difficult. And Elena kept a copy of the final page at home. She placed it beside a photograph of her mother. Whenever life became difficult, she looked at that photograph and remembered that her mother had once been forgotten by powerful people, but never forgotten by the daughter who believed her. Years later, Mia would tell people that the most important thing her mother ever taught her wasn't how to become successful. It was how to remain kind after life gave you every reason to become bitter. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps these stories reach someone who may need a reminder that their struggles do not define their future. And before we end, I have a special request for you. Comment. Kindness is stronger than money. If you believe that one act of compassion can change someone's entire life, your comment might be exactly the encouragement another person needs today. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly at the edge of the room isn't powerless. Sometimes they're simply waiting for someone to finally ask them what they know. And sometimes, the most valuable thing a person can offer isn't $1,000,000. It's the truth. It's forgiveness. It's a second chance. And above all, it's kindness.